Welcome everybody back to the Kumeyaay channel. We're going to continue our series on a people's history of the United States, chapter 12, the Empire of the People. We started with chapter 9, which was Reconstruction, and now we're moving on to more, I guess you would call it national or international relations. So this is more my expertise. I've studied this quite a bit, so I'll have a little more input than the other previous chapters. So we start our chapter during the Spanish-American War. So one of the things about American imperialism and American empire is people don't even equate those terms together. And that's partly because the United States was always hiding its empire or imperial ambitions, and we'll cover that in a moment. So in 1983 or 1893, we had the severe depression. This was the Great Depression before the actual Great Depression in 1929. And it was, Roosevelt was quoted, I should welcome almost any war, and I think this country needs one. And war has this thing of uniting against a common enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. War unites, and it also drives capitalism, also known today as the industrial military complex. So the nationalism is fostered, capitalism is fostered, and these ideals are very, very, very American. But they're also in other countries too. It's pretty universal to some extent in developed, especially European colonial powers. One of the things that happened early on is way before this time period was the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine was this idea that, and this was created during Mexican independence, that Latin America is the sphere of the United States. And this would later extend to Hawaii, Japan, and the markets of China, where our domain is much larger than people realize, and it was made implicit by policymakers in such things as the Monroe Doctrine. Explicit, I'm sorry. Um, State departments issues lists of precedents during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So one of the most telling pages is, and for you teachers out there, I just want to let you know this is a cool companion, the abridged teachers edition. So my page numbers are different than yours, but this is a really cool thing for teachers to use or resource, because it has questions at the end, and you can use that for essays or quizzes like I do. And for the students out there, the answers aren't on here. So just if you're wondering. So we have here um, a really telling page. So my page is 220. I'm sure yours is different if you're using this one. But it's that second page into the chapter where it goes through a series of 103 interventions the United States participated in the affairs of other countries between 1798 and 1895. So within 100 years, I think it's 103 years, there's 103 interventions. That's easy to remember. I'm starting with Argentina, Nicaragua, Japan, Nicaragua again, Uruguay, China, Hawaii, Nicaragua again, and it's really telling, and to just see that on a page. And this was actually issued by the State Department during the Cuban Missile Crisis to kind of show precedent of the United States interventions, and almost using it as actually using it as a justification for more intervention. So one of the things to realize, I want to make clear, and Zinn makes clear, is that a lot of imperialistic ideas were founded on racism. And this is the idea of and especially if you study, I always tell students to read to understand colonization, to understand the colonization of Africa. There is a book called King Leopold's Ghost that's very telling, where the Belgian king and the European powers cut up Africa like a cake. And there's this idea called the white man's burden. This idea goes throughout all the world of the undeveloped and the black and brown folks as colonies are created, and you have policymakers um, really talk about race when they're saying we need to do this. This is our our God-given right. Manifest destiny, in fact, was the same idea where the superior race, the superior civilization, it's their opportunity, and not just their opportunity, their obligation to subjugate and civilize the black and brown people of the world. So the United States did that with Native Americans in particular, but they continue that idea of manifest destiny and the subjugation of inferior race into the Philippines and other islands. So we have here, and I'm trying to keep these videos to under 30 minutes. So I'm not really gonna quote too much. So if you read the chapter, you'll know what I mean. So right here at this point, we have Hawaii coming into play. President Benjamin Harris did not annex Hawaii yet, but at this point, you have the Dole, Stanford Dole, basically creating a provisional government in Hawaii, who was a corporation, and you have the Dole Company literally taking over Hawaii in 1893. And I think this is similar to the East India Company of the Brits when they took over India. It was actually a corporation, but they became a colonial power and then backed by the government later. Actually, I think that was, I don't think there was any delay in the British encounter, but with the United States, they were kind of hesitant, but eventually they aligned their interests with the business executive interests of the Dole Company. And so you have a real push before the Spanish-American War by all facets of society. You have the military brass, the businessmen, influential politicians. You have like people like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, and what they really wanted. So here's why American imperialism and empire is kind of hidden, is because what the Americans wanted, and I think they learned about it by precedents, by studying the English experience, is that the colonial experience was very costly, it was very risky, and if you didn't have to do it, it was better not to. And in a way that the same people thought of slavery at the Reconstruction. Well, if we can get the same result without all this extra stuff, extra cost, extra variables, let's do it. So that's why the northern industrialists wanted to switch to wage laborers instead of slavery, because it was cheaper and it was easier. You didn't have to take care of them so much. And the colonial experience was similar in the fact that if we could just open the markets, that was better because we didn't have all this extra cost, extra variables. So we preferred open markets over colonies or war. And so that really was the idea of open door. So American open door policy is born at this point, and it dominated foreign policy in the 20th century, in particular China. So China had the most people at the time, the biggest market. So we extended our manifest destiny doctrine all the way across the Pacific into China. And that ultimately was made very the manifest destiny doctrine was very clear about that it wanted to keep going. It didn't want to just subjugate the frontier in the West. It wanted to keep going all the way to China. It wanted to go to the San Francisco harbor and into the open markets. So that's the real difference with American imperialism. So sophisticated American imperialism only used military action to open markets. It didn't want to stay there. It didn't want to really create colonies. At this point, China becomes partitioned by European powers without the United States. So currently you have China making a statement, I think last week, saying we will never be conquered or victimized ever again. And what people who don't know this time in history, that's what China was talking about last week, is they were referring to in 1897 of this partitioning of European powers to have sphere of influence. And this is, and the US eventually gets in on the action, but it wasn't there at first. Okay, so let me just briefly look at my notes. So you now have the Cuban Revolt happening in 1895 and 98. And this kind of opens the door for the Spanish-American War, because the Spanish Empire was in decline since. So I'm from San Diego. I'm Kumeyaay. We encountered Father Serra. That was the very first European and Kumeyaay, and actually the beginning of, some would call the beginning of the modern California era. But one of the things to mention, in 1769, the Spanish Empire was already in decline. Its best days were behind it. So by 1895, you have the Spanish Empire kind of just being a former, literally a shadow of itself. And you have the Cuban Revolt rising up. U.S. initially had popular support. So it was always this kind of, and this kind of happens in Iraq later on, where you have this fight for liberation and freedom. And it's always this kind of common connection to the United States, fight for liberation and freedom. So you had a lot of people really understanding it in their own idea from, how to, that the Cubans were going through what we went through. So, but it was a mixed bag. And in 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine was destroyed by a mysterious explosion. No one really knew or connected it to the rebels or not, but there was definitely a belief that maybe it was the rebels. And so you had this kind of stoking, the first kind of domino to fall was the Maine being exploded, the U.S. battleship. And then you had the Teller Amendment. So in 1898, the Teller Amendment pledged not to annex Cuba. It just wanted this open door policy. And so it started to become more hawkish. You have the Navy, especially after the Maine was destroyed. You have robber barons like Morgan and Rockefeller feeling militant. Big corporations wanted a war to relieve this suspense. So after 1893, it really took a while, and it took this war to actually come out of, where we were at in the Depression, or that severe depression, in the same way that World War II brought many out of the actual Great Depression. This is what the war was that they were hoping, because it would also spark consumerism and buying. McKinley presents. Okay, so McKinley eventually. So the question is, what led McKinley to declare war on Spain? Public opinion, newspapers, they hysterically pushed for war. Some thought war was for Cuban independence. The Teller Amendment also basically said we are not going to annex Cuba. It was this kind of guarantee. So it was ultimately, started and it ended in 3 months. So the Spanish-American War was super, super short. In that same time, the Filipino, as we started taking over the Philippines, which was a colony of Spain, that there was a resistance movement that happened for 3 years. And that was pretty brutal, and it was crushed by United States asymmetric warfare. So it wasn't a fair war. Okay. So you have the Socialists, so the workers. It was a rag, the Appeal to Reason, or the rag as a newspaper. And you had a lot of folks kind of against American imperialism right around this time. And so you had, it was stated that this is a favorite method of rulers to keep the people from redressing domestic wrongs. The poor killing the poor for the rich. So you had, a lot of the things that we say now were being said there about war, about why it was fought and how it was fought. And so you did have an opposition. But what happened is, and this happened after 9/11, after a Gulf War, the minute war starts, you get a fervor, and you're not able to oppose a war as you were in the beginning. and it has some, I think it's just a psychological thing. For example, I remember when Iraq 2 started, or yeah, was that Iraq 2? Yes. So the Gulf War 2 with George Bush Jr., that the Dixie Chicks, for example, said something bad. And this is kind of a funny, maybe I could come up with a better one. But, they're from this, that part of the United States where, it's a little more patriotic and more nationalistic. And I remember they got so much flack for that. And lo and behold, the war actually ended up becoming, not the justification, like the weapons of mass destruction, they were not found and all that. And we'll cover that later. But what I'm trying to say is, once war is started, it's so hard to oppose it because you have this hysteria that's being created. And that's what happened after the Spanish-American War. And the workers, like unions, actually, they started benefiting from the war. So employment and higher wages um, was a result of the war. So the workers unions benefited from it, which is exactly what the corporate interests wanted. But you also have higher prices and higher taxes. So it wasn't all good, but there were certainly benefits to war, just like there always is. Why did the United States provoke a war? Was Spain was it trying to acquire colonies? I don't know. Really, I'm pretty sure that was its idea. And one of the things, that's actually a harder question to answer. That's more of a debate. So you can kind of go back and forth with that. But there was definitely this idea of corruption and profiteering. Why the United States wanted to go to war. There really wasn't a good reason to go to war with Spain. And if you look at the history of war from the beginning, it's usually what's the word, on purpose, I guess you would say, for a couple reasons. Okay, so I digress. Okay, so we had here the Spanish-American War only lasted 3 months. And one of the things, Cuba is really one of the things that Zinn focuses on. He really doesn't talk about the Philippines very much, or Spain at all. He doesn't, but what he really focuses is on like Cuba. And there's a reason why. So one of the reason why he does that is because Cuba is very telling for, I guess, why we went to war. If you look at, initially when the Cuban rebels started revolting, there was this idea we were fighting for their ideas, their idea of freedom and liberation, which was similar to us in 1776. However, what happened was, after the war was over in Cuba, the rebels were ignored. They weren't included, and in fact, the same Spanish civil authorities were chosen over those democratically elected Cuban rebels. So we were certainly hypocritical in the fact that we didn't want them to have a democratically elected government like we had, because we wanted to make sure our open door policy was secure. And that was the whole point for us for the war. It wasn't for Cuban independence, even though we said that. And it also, the Teller Amendment was actually reversed, which was that we would not annex Cuba, because as we started getting to the end and got to the end, we completely showed our cards, if you will, why we did it and what we were there for. So we put the same people in charge and overrode a democratically elected government by the Cuban people. American capital eventually took over the railroad, mining, and sugar and minerals. Um, and so you had all this allocation of land being just given to corporations. The United Fruit Company is perhaps the most notorious. We're given about 2 million acres. The Cubans did not like this. They went on strike. So the U.S. eventually didn't annex Cuba, but it was like a pseudo colony. So we didn't absolutely it was definitely a betrayal of Cuban independence, but it was not really. We looked at the Teller Amendment that's saying we weren't annexed, so we kind of followed the Teller Amendment, but we added the Platt Amendment, and this Platt Amendment gave us the right to intervene at any point in time for the preservation of Cuban independence. Um, and maintenance of government adequate for the protection of life, liberty, property, and individual liberty. You know, it's just kind of fluffy in that way. But the moral of the story was it gave us the right to intervene at any time if our open door policy, if our corporate interests weren't being followed. Um, and so this is, of course, a betrayal of a lot of what we aspired in the beginning before the war started. Eventually, though, with the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, you have the annexation of Puerto Rico, the Hawaiian Islands in 1898, the Wake Islands, Guam, and the Philippines. And so we gave Spain $20 million for Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as in the peace treaty. And God told President McKinley that to take the Philippines and to educate and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and he slept soundly. So the Filipino Revolt, we covered that, and one of the things that comes up in this Filipino Revolt is it really brought out a lot of racism, paternalism, and you have Americans being extremely racist, calling Filipinos the N word, and you had a lot of this kind of, again, race taking center stage. So you have here, let me just quote, my page is 229. You have a United States, I believe it was senators standing in front of all us legislators, all our government, and you have him saying this. So just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat. The mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world. It has been charged that our conduct of the war has been cruel. Senators, it has been the reverse. Senators, we must remember that we are not dealing with Americans or Europeans. We are dealing with Orientals. So there's an excellent book called Orientalism on Edward Said. He has a 3 books that are, very telling. So I tell you, I would reference that book for this quote in particular. Okay, so yeah, let me moving on. Okay, so all right, actually, I'm doing good on time. So anti-imperialist league. So there was an anti-imperialist league in 1898. Again, there was a lot of people that were against imperialism in the beginning because you could just, like, I guess, read through between the lines and realize the true intention. So this isn't something you find out later. I guess historians, wasn't something we just discovered. This was known at the time. You even have Mark Twain at the moment at this time said, "We are a world power. With the Spanish-American War over, it is simply massacre and murderous butchery." Um, so these rebels at the time had the entire support of the native community. So one of the things that's really not covered well, but it's there, is the Philippine resistance, and the entire island, the country did not want the Americans there. It had the entire support, but with asymmetric warfare, when you have technology so far advanced in weapons and all these things, that it's not even fair. It doesn't matter really, because you just really destroy your opposition with they don't have a chance. So this debate of annexation was pretty heated. It was really challenging, and it actually was only ratified by 1 vote. Now, there's a couple moments in history where we don't realize it, but things barely almost didn't pass. The Trail of Tears, for example, the Indian Removal Act only passed by 4 votes. This only passed by 1 vote. The Anti-Imperialist League was in severe opposition, and at this point, racism was peaking. So you have, and what happens with this moment in time is that racism is everywhere. It's at home, it's abroad, it's during the Philippine War, the Philippine resistance, and you have a lot of this stuff in the rhetoric. When you read it, you can just feel it and see it and hear it. So at this point, 2 lynchings a week were on average in the newspapers, and the government wasn't stopping it. So the KKK was literally doing what it wants in the South, and the North was not really, sending in troops or doing anything. Largely went unchecked. So you have the dehumanization and domination at home and abroad of Black and brown people. It is simply so let me kind of read my notes for a moment. But one of the interesting things was that Black and brown folks still join the military, and a lot of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Blacks, they were joining the military. And they joined it for a lot of reasons. Lack of opportunity is probably number one. Racial pride, patriotism, and need to prove you're courageous. And so you have a lot of also, but you also have an opposition from the Black and brown folks who opposed the war. They didn't like the use of the N word against the Philippine folks. And so yeah, the kind of end of the chapter kind of peters out a little bit. And so I'm just going down. Okay, so yeah. So the moral of the story for me, and is just to make a final note, is this is the height of American imperialism and power. And we have here the kind of the start of American empire just really reaching its apex. And you have a lot of these policies being made, and the justifications. I would pay attention to why, like what was driving the policymakers to do it, because if you espouse to be a Christian, God-fearing nation, you're going to have to justify it with certain words, with certain language. And what I would like you to pay attention to is what were they using at home and abroad to do these things that in hindsight were pretty bad things. And so that language, that justification, that dehumanization, that's really what drove this moment in history. And you also have the rise of eugenics. So you have this belief that white folks were superior in their DNA. And you just have to look at look how the difference, look at the difference. These people are uncivilized savages. So that's really one of the moments in time where that's at its peak. And I think we're at a moment in time in 2021 where hopefully that's being rooted out of our history. But you can't ignore this moment in time and the legacy it has left. And so it's still here, and our history books need to be more explicit on that stuff. So okay, thank you very much. I will be doing my next video on Friday on chapter 13. I believe that's the social movement, the rise of unions, and all that. That's a little more sophisticated, longer. It'll be a little more challenging. This chapter I thought was pretty straightforward. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on Friday. Bye.